It may be hard to believe, but it has been 3 years since we first saw this video of Vladimir Putin announcing a special military operation into Ukraine. And although that did not actually last 3 days, the fact that we are still here is itself interesting, as the war trudges on well past the length of an average war. But given that, now seems like a good time to take a broader look at where we are in this conflict, in part how we got here, and then what may actually be happening in the near future. Moreover, those questions take on all the greater importance now that Donald Trump is in office, and sending signals that in fact he would like this war to end, and the terms by which it ends he's relatively indifferent toward. Indeed, for anyone unclear about the gravity of the situation, this photo revealed everything, as a US delegation met a Russian delegation inside of Saudi Arabia. Continuing with that thought, it seems likely that Trump and Putin will meet face to face, if they haven't already by the time that you watch this video. However, and I cannot repeat this enough, there is a huge difference between concepts of a peace plan and a fully realized peace, which is all the more reason why we need to take a view of this war from 30,000 feet, which we will accomplish today. Specifically, we are going to focus on 4 points here. We will begin with an exploration of why war is relatively rare on the international stage, all things considered. Then we'll get a little bit more focused and take a look at the Russia-Ukraine war specifically. And rather than looking at why it started, the important question for right now is why it is still ongoing. We'll look at a variety of answers there, some plausible and some less plausible. Third, we will switch back to the wide lens and look at how wars end, broadly speaking, before narrowing ourselves down again to this specific war and looking at least the concepts of a peace plan and the problems that come along with it. You might have already noticed that this video feels a little bit different. Well, that is because it is. We're not going to be doing my traditional style of presentation today. Instead, we're going to be borrowing from what my traditional job looks like. Every now and then, I have to do some sort of briefing or presentation to a real-life audience. And, well, given the current situation in the world, the best topic to talk about is the end of the war, or at least the potential of a peace plan. As a consequence, I have been giving this presentation in real life a bunch, and I thought it would be useful for you to see it as well. And it turns out that in normal briefings, you tend to not get the multimedia experience, featuring videos like what you see now, or my preferred Ken Burns-style animations. It makes the people in the room dizzy, and they love to complain about it. So for those of you who enjoy a good Australian PowerPoint presentation about military affairs, rejoice, because that is what you are getting today. It also means that I am unscripted here, so this will be much more conversational than my usual video. And, last point here, you may have seen these topics before in various different videos on this channel, but rather than getting one puzzle piece at a time, I want to try to put all of them together so you get the bigger picture. Also, if you ever need to explain to someone what lines on maps are, this will be your go-to. First, though, to be blunt, it has been incredibly difficult to keep track of all of the news over the last couple of weeks. There were meetings in Brussels, and goodness, the variation in the headlines there is something that we could spend a half an hour on. Then a phone call between Putin and Trump, the announcement that there would be face-to-face talks, and the culmination of that summit, which we saw earlier. You can also observe variation in the reporting there, with the French government-owned France 24 using a run-of-the-mill headline, while others chose to address Ukraine's absence at the table. Indeed, right-leaning outlets tended to portray the absence of a Ukrainian voice in a neutral light, while center sources discussed Europe's unease over the situation. How do I know all of this? It is thanks to today's sponsor and returning friend of the channel, Ground News. You, too, can quickly internalize all of this information with their Vantage plan, which showcases the funding sources of news outlets, government, private, or otherwise. And by signing up using my special URL, ground.news/linesonmaps, you can take 40% off the regular price. So head over there today to inform yourself and support this channel. Okay, let's begin with the basics of why war is relatively rare. And if you are familiar with our standard lines on maps logic, or what we would more professionally describe as crisis bargaining theory, then you already know what I'm going to be going over here, and so you might just want to skip to the next chapter. For those of you still here, let's think about a pure territorial conflict to make the logic a little bit easier to visualize. Still, what I'm about to say does apply to any policy dispute. It is just easier to draw the lines when we are talking about land. Let's pretend for a moment that we are omniscient creatures, capable of understanding everything that could possibly happen during this war. Then it would be possible for us to draw an expected outcome of war, say, hypothetically here. This is not me saying that this is the one true outcome of the war. I am not an omniscient creature. But I need to draw a line somewhere, and visually it will be helpful if I draw it about there. Nor am I trying to suggest that only one thing is possible during a war. There are a lot of random events that occur on the battlefield during a war, and the results of those random events determine where the outcome ultimately lies. Thus, it is possible with some probability that the outcome of the war will end up over here, or alternatively, will end up way over here instead. Thus, what this line represents is the weighted average of all of the possibilities, including the two that you just saw, plus everything in between, multiplied out by the probability that they actually do happen. Of course, wars do not just produce an outcome. There is a process that leads to those possible outcomes. And that process involves a lot of death, destruction of property, economic sanctions, economic distortions, lost economic growth, and all sorts of downsides associated with fighting a violent battle. Consequently, the actual outcome that both sides internalize is not just this division, it's this division minus some costs. For Russia, we will use this red line to represent its costs. Specifically, the space between the white and red lines is the costs of war to Russia, including all of those lost lives and economic productivity, converted to square kilometers of territory. Once again, and this will apply to every other line that I draw today, I am not trying to suggest that the actual sum costs of war for Russia is equal to the space seen on the screen now. Rather, it is just helpful to have a visual representation, and giving it that much space gives me a little bit more room to work around. Importantly, though, wherever in practice this red line would be drawn, it has to be bound to the white line, and specifically east of the white line. That is because the costs of war make the outcome of war look less attractive to Russia, and the way that you make it look less attractive to Russia territorially is to shift everything to the right. Having done all of that, the red line that you see here is not just a literal red line, it is a figurative red line. It is the minimum that Russia must receive in any sort of negotiated settlement, to prefer that settlement to continuing the war. That is because if you drew a ceasefire line east of the red line, if Russia rejected it and fought instead, the outcome of the war would be drawn in expectation to where the white line is. And even if you factor in all of the lost costs between the white and the red lines, the war outcome for Russia is better than the hypothetical settlement, which you will recall was east of the red line. Now, I know that the first time you see this, it feels a little bit weird to try to convert the value of human life to things like square kilometers of territory or other tangible goods. To wit, I suspect if you go into the comments section below and delve deep enough, you will find someone who is completely flabbergasted by the suggestion that I would even think about things in this manner. However, I assure you that this is something that governments do on a regular basis, and indeed, you do every day as well. The United States government, for example, values every American life at $10 million. In other words, if there is some sort of policy change that will save 3 lives, then the cost of that policy change must be less than $30 million. If it is, the government will implement it. If it is not, then the government is willing to sacrifice those 3 humans. As for yourself, when was the last time that you drove to work? Well, when you did that, you were implicitly making a similar sort of calculation. Going to work makes you money. However, Did you know that more than 100 Americans die every day in car accidents? You just gambled that the risk was relatively low compared to how much money that you would make. And, well, you know what? It pays off for most of us most of the time. As an interesting side note, I have made similar presentations to this countless of times to military audiences. And never, and I mean not once, has anyone in a military audience objected to what I have just said. It is a super controversial point for college freshmen. You will get tons of objections there. But for the people that actually have to internalize this process, well, they already have, and they've learned to live with it. Anyway, back to the lines. We need to think through the same process for Ukraine. But instead of a red line drawn to the east of the white line, it is going to be a yellow line drawn to the west of the white line. Once again, the space between the yellow and white lines represents how Ukraine internalizes its costs of war in terms of square kilometers of territory. Note further, and this applies analogously to Russia, if Ukraine cares a lot about the territory at stake, then the way it will internalize the same loss of life and economic resources is going to be relatively small, as compared to a situation where Ukraine is less resolved and does not care at all about the territory, in which case the way that its cost would be represented is through a larger space between the yellow and white lines. Resetting things, and just like Russia before it, the yellow line represents Ukraine's bargaining position. The most that Ukraine would be willing to give up goes up to that yellow line. The reason being is that if you were to draw a new border to the west of the yellow line, Ukraine could fight and, in expectation, take back up to the white line, and even after its costs of war, its valuation for that outcome would put it at the yellow line, which is better than the hypothetical line that was drawn west of the yellow line. And once we recognize that the yellow and red lines represent both parties' bargaining positions, something interesting happens. If we delete that white line, everything between the yellow and red lines represents what we might call a bargaining range. It is the set of territorial divisions that lead to better outcomes for both parties than fighting to a relatively similar outcome and suffering the costs of war associated with going through that costly process. The bargaining range always covers the expected outcome of war, represented by the white line, and flares out to the east and the west by an amount determined by how each side internalizes the costs of war. Now, the upshot for humanity here is that the very fact that war is unattractive gives both parties a whole bunch of incentive to try to negotiate a way out of a war, to stop a war from being started, and then once a war has started, to try to figure out a resolution to the war that then reduces the amount of costs that both parties are paying. And indeed, this is why war is relatively rare in the world. Yes, it is almost always the case that you can find somewhere in any given year that two countries are fighting one another. However, there are lots of different countries in the world that could be possibly fighting each other, and it is true that in any given year, two random countries are very unlikely to be fighting a war. And in fact, the odds of two random countries fighting in any given year historically is less than 1%. And it's all because war is costly. Once more, because war is unattractive, fortunately wars are relatively rare events. However, that leaves open the question of why countries do sometimes end up fighting each other, and perhaps more pressing for us today, why is it that Russia and Ukraine continue fighting this war 3 years into it? Well, the reason that this exercise remains important for those questions is because it helps us understand what are good explanations for war and what are bad explanations for war. Way, way, way too often, when you look at the media, you take a look at political analysis, or you open up a history textbook, the recipe for war seems to be something along the lines of, there's a substantive disagreement between the two parties, and therefore they fight. And sure, that is going to stay in our recipe book. If you don't have something that you are in conflict over, then no one is going to be killing each other to get something that no one wants. The problem here is that the substantive disagreement by itself does not explain why a war occurs. We just go back a previous slide. This is an example where two parties are diametrically opposed over some sort of issue at stake, here Ukrainian territory, and despite that, as long as you can reason what the expected outcome of war would be. If both sides find the war costly, then there's still going to be a range of settlements that are mutually preferable to an outcome that produces that, but also comes with the costs associated with fighting. So yes, we are going to keep step 1, have a substantive disagreement, as a part of our recipe, but we are not going to close the book there. That would be equivalent to saying that the recipe for boiling water is step 1, get water. Sure, you need water to boil water, but you also need something to heat it up. And in this analogy, our source of heat is what we call a bargaining friction, something that prevents the two parties from saving on the costs of war. And I am not making an abstract academic complaint here. If you need both of these things for war to actually happen, then that tells us something about how you can stop a war from happening, or stop a war from continuing if one is ongoing. Most countries are not at war with one another, even though there are substantive disagreements all over the place in the world. And even if we are looking at situations that have devolved into war, the vast majority of those end up in some sort of negotiated settlement. And the reason for this is not some sort of glorious political discourse. It is not like two countries that have some sort of substantive disagreement between each other will sit down at a table and then undergo a 2-hour moderated debate, at the end of which one of them will realize that it was in the wrong, apologize, and then terminate the disagreement. No, the reason that these sorts of things end short of a war is because the parties realize that there is some sort of settlement that will be better for both parties than actually fighting that war. And if it does end up in some sort of a war due to one of these bargaining frictions that we'll get to in a moment, the way that it ends is not because of a substantive disagreement being resolved. It's because they learn something or something changes about the facts on the ground that resolves the bargaining friction. And once the bargaining friction is gone, there's no reason to continue fighting. Either that, or there's one side militarily defeating the other, but that is relatively rare by comparison. The upshot here for third parties that might be interested in ending a war is that you don't actually have to resolve the substantive disagreement between the two parties. If you just figure out whatever the bargaining friction is, or maybe manipulate the incentives that surround the bargaining friction, you can avoid further conflict. And that provides a nice transition to the second topic for today, which is why the Russia-Ukraine war still continues. What I'm going to be doing here is looking at the 4 most commonly discussed explanations, give you the reasoning behind them, and then my take on their plausibility. And those 4 are disagreement over the expected outcome of the war, Russia trying to stall Ukraine's entry into NATO, entrenchments and power shifts, which you may recall is a topic that we've discussed on this channel recently, and finally, Putin's personal benefits. And of course, the lines on maps will continue until morale improves. Remember that this white line represents the expected outcome of the war. If we had full information, and we knew everything that could possibly happen over the course of the war, we could average out all of those different probabilities and weigh them according to the outcomes that they are associated with, then that produces the white line in expectation. Now, you might recall that when I first introduced this expected outcome line, I described it as a good exercise for an omniscient creature, someone who knows everything about the world and can work through all of the different possibilities of things that could happen over the course of a war. In contrast, you and I are not omniscient creatures, and as a consequence, that is why I have stressed that this is just some hypothetical line that I drew on a map for convenience and visualization purposes, because I myself can't draw this line properly. In contrast again, intelligence organizations are better at thinking through these sorts of processes. But they too are not perfect, and if there is a disagreement over where the expected outcome line might be, perhaps because each intelligence organization has private information about how the war might play out, they might know something about their own militaries that the other side doesn't know, or, thinking about this in terms of the start of the war, Ukraine might know something about the quality of Russian forces that the Kremlin doesn't know. Regardless of how that comes about, this is going to create a problem. Well, very plausibly, maybe the intelligence organizations have different expectations, or to visualize it, something like this, where Russia believes that the expected outcome of the war is far west of what Ukraine's expectation looks like. Well, even accounting for costs, you might not get a set of demands that are compatible. Here, Russia's costs go from the white line on the left, corresponding to its own expectations, to the red line, meaning that Russia needs at least to the red line to be satisfied. And meanwhile, Ukraine's costs run from the yellow line to the white line on the right, reflecting its own expectation, meaning that Ukraine needs at least to the yellow line for things to work out. Well, if you are trying to figure out a settlement that is simultaneously west of the red line and east of the yellow line, good luck to you. That's just not physically possible. Now, for clarity, just because there is a difference in expectations does not mean that negotiations are doomed. For example, if there's a difference in expectations but it is not as extreme, well, here you could have compatible demands be met. So it is not simply that a bargaining friction exists that dooms negotiations, and this will be important for later. It is also the extent to which that bargaining friction exists as it relates to the other incentives on the ground. Here, for example, how costly the two parties view war. In terms of the plausibility of this particular mechanism causing continued conflict between Ukraine and Russia, yeah, I think it is a reasonable case. For me personally, I still do not have a good sense of what is happening right now with long-run prospects of Western aid. You have Trump, who over the past month has been flip-flopping between Ukraine and Russia, and at least as I am currently recording this, has broken very hard towards Russia over the last few days. The problem is that I don't have much confidence in the consistency of that message. So if you are watching this video 2 weeks or 2 months from now, I can't be sure that the same message is being delivered, or if we haven't switched back to something that is completely the opposite. I suppose for any given time period, the most likely thing that the Trump administration will be doing a week or a month from now is whatever the messaging currently is right now. But my confidence about that prediction about a week, never mind a month, is going to be relatively low. In other words, I can think of it as being a perfectly plausible world where the United States goes back to doing something else. And despite me talking about this for almost a minute now, we have not even broached the topic of the European Union. In other words, if the United States indeed withdraws all aid from Ukraine, what does Europe do in response? How much aid will Europe give to Ukraine? And even if you can focus in on whatever that aid amount might be from Europe, what is the quality of that aid from the perspective of Ukraine? In other words, we know what Ukraine is capable of doing with US weapon systems, and we know what Ukraine is capable of doing with the European weapon systems that they currently have. But what does the military situation look like if you cut out the United States part and then flood in more European parts? There are a whole bunch of question marks about all of those different topics. And as long as there are competing intelligence assessments coming out of both Russia and Ukraine that are relatively optimistic given a baseline expectation, well, you have a perfect recipe for war. And let me be a little bit more specific about that mechanism, because the logic gets complicated. Obviously, the United States withdrawing aid from Ukraine would be bad news for Ukraine, and as a corollary, good news for Russia. What I mean by optimism here is in the light of that news. So hold fixed a default expectation that this is relatively bad for Ukraine and relatively good for Russia. Where you run into a problem is if Russia thinks that it is pretty good news or very good news, and meanwhile, Ukraine recognizes it as bad news, but doesn't think it's particularly bad news. Ukraine would still like the aid coming from the United States, but also simultaneously thinks that it is not the end of the world. That's where you end up with differing expectations and the possibility of continued warfare. Okay, I really do want to move past uncertainty and competing expectations, but there is still one more thing worth discussing, and that is Russia's progress on the Eastern Front. This is what it has looked like over the last 7 months, and there are huge question marks from Western intelligence officials about how sustainable this is. Clearly, Russia is making gains, but the casualties that Russia is taking in order to do this have been substantial, and how well Ukraine is going to be able to fight back in the future depends on how effective Russia is going to be at recruiting to make up for those losses. That is something that depends, for instance, on the economic situation in Russia, which Russian officials will have private information about, and Western officials and Ukrainian officials might speculate about, but not actually know. We will return to the Russian economy in a minute, The concluding point here, though, is that there are tons of question marks about what's going on in the war, and thus it is very plausible to believe that there are differing expectations in Ukraine and Russia about what the outcome is. Now, ironically, I have uncertainty about whether that actually is the primary bargaining friction going on here. The point is, though, that it should remain in the conversation. And continuing the conversation, it's time to move on to stalling Ukrainian entry into NATO as a possible mechanism for the war. Fortunately, this one should be a shorter conversation, because while it is theoretically reasonable, it is also substantively implausible at this point. Let's start with the theory part. In short, Russia likes being able to exert control over Ukrainian politics, and I'm not just talking about over the last 3 years, or even since 2014, or even since Ukrainian independence following the end of the Soviet Union. I'm talking about way further back than even that. If Ukraine had NATO membership, then that would give Ukraine Article 5 coverage, which says that an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. And thus, if Ukraine were to fight back against Russian domestic political influence in the country, resist it, and then Russia try to fight back in response militarily, then Ukraine would get the benefit of NATO protection. NATO would come in and step in to try to defend Ukraine from Russia, which, rolling back everything, makes it much more difficult for Russia to be able to leverage the threat to use the military to coerce Ukraine to change its domestic politics. In terms of how that gets us to a war, Russia might want to invade Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from going through the membership accession process. NATO has a rule that says that incoming members must resolve all ongoing territorial disputes before they get final approval. Thus, Russia invades, the territorial conflicts flare up, Ukraine can't join NATO. It's basically the same story as the Georgia War in 2008. To illustrate, suppose that this is the outcome of a war if Russia fights to a military end right now. Well, in our previous discussions of lines on maps, we've only been thinking about that as a snapshot in time. But in practice, the balance of power between the two actors might change. Most important for us here, if Ukraine has NATO protection and Article 5 coverage, then perhaps the post-NATO war outcome, should Ukraine and Russia come to blows, moves all the way to over there. Again, these are all hypothetical lines, but the point is that the difference between what today's outcome of war might look like compared to a future outcome of war should Ukraine have NATO protection, those two things could be vastly different. And if that is the case, then the outcome that Russia might obtain from a war today may be much better than what it expects to be able to get in the long run if it could maximally coerce Ukraine under NATO protection. In terms of substantive plausibility, though, we begin to run into some problems. War in this context is only sensible insofar as you believe that continued progress on the ground, or at least continued disruption on the ground, has a tangible effect on the timeline to Ukraine's entry into NATO. The thing is, though, that NATO countries are extremely reluctant to budge on the position of no ongoing territorial disputes as a prerequisite for entry. And I am not just talking about active firefights here. The no ongoing territorial disputes clause covers substantive disagreements. In other words, Russia does not need to be actively bombing Ukrainian territory for that clause to have an effect. Obviously, undergoing active bombing operations is going to exacerbate things, but it is not necessary. The sheer fact that the Kremlin has a substantive policy that differs from Ukraine's policy on where to draw the line between the two countries is enough to sink Ukrainian NATO membership. And you see this reflected in how Turkey and Hungary have been vocally against Ukrainian membership for years now, which is relevant because you need unanimity to be able to get a new member into NATO. For a while, although this was a bit under the media radar, you would hear similar sorts of concerns from, say, the United States and Germany, that again, as long as there are ongoing territorial disputes, they don't want to have Ukraine in NATO either. And then, for people who are not paying as close attention, you had Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at NATO headquarters in Brussels say explicitly that Ukrainian membership in NATO is not something that is on the table right now. Again, this got a ton of media attention, but it wasn't anything new. This has been the underlying policy and discussions within NATO for a long period of time now. Of course, Ukraine and NATO are continuing to discuss what long-term membership might look like, But all of that is contingent on this being settled between Ukraine and Russia, which, at least in the short and medium term, is not something that's plausible. And that is why this is not as plausible of an explanation for the war's continuation. Maybe it has some sort of causal leverage over why the war began, but the continuation of the war right now is not having a tangible effect on Ukraine's timeline on entry into NATO. And just to drive that point home, we talked about Georgia a moment ago. How long did the war between Russia and Georgia last? It was only 16 days, not 3 years. And the reason it only needed to be 16 days is because Russia only needed 16 days to flare up the territorial conflict between Georgia and Russia, which thereby prevented Georgia's entry into NATO. Well, here we are 16 years later. And how much discussion do you hear about Georgia joining NATO? All it took was 16 days to quash that. And while perhaps the situation with Ukraine might be more complicated, it doesn't take 3 years of war to quash Ukraine's entry into NATO. Moving on. Third on the list is the problem that comes with entrenchments and power shifts. I am going to keep this one the shortest because it is a recurring topic across my channels. But the main point is going back to this graph from before and trying to understand what exactly is going on here. Well, like we talked about a few minutes ago, part of that is because Russia is throwing a ton of manpower, and, quite frankly, lives, into trying to advance along the Eastern Front. And indeed, they are making that progress, with hundreds of square kilometers taken per month each month over the last 7 months. At the same time, though, it is worth asking why Russia is willing to do this. And the major part of the answer there is that the Kremlin thinks that there is an opportunity, all because of what we see on the screen here. Or, more accurately, the lack of things like this. Way back in the summer of 2023, Ukraine made a gamble to go on the offensive, and thus dumped a ton of resources into building offensive units, and spending less time trying to build defensive entrenchments like the one that you see here. It is a gamble that did not ultimately pay off, ironically because Russia had spent the previous half year developing its own set of fortifications, which did indeed hold up. And now Russia has been punching back for more than a year, successfully moving the front lines. To be clear, it's not a disaster for Ukraine. Going back to these numbers, all told, this accumulation over 7 months is still less than 0.5% of the total Ukrainian territory. But it is still not what Ukraine would like to be doing, namely having defensive fortifications, holding a front line, keeping it steady, and causing deeper casualties by Russia going into the front lines, not succeeding, and repeating that process over and over again. The thing is, though, until Ukraine can establish a defensive line somewhere, even if it is not along the current line of control, there's going to be a bargaining problem in terms of trying to resolve the conflict, and not in a way that's favorable to Ukraine. Let's go back to the map. Again, think about this white line as representing what the expected outcome of the war would be if the war continues today to a military conclusion. Again, I don't know where that is, but I can tell you that if Ukraine has time to build trenches, the expected outcome of a war, if it were to be fought later following Ukraine having trenches established, would look maybe something like this. Regardless of where exactly it is, it's definitely going to be to the right of today's war outcome expectation. And thus, Russia will either reject a ceasefire proposal or not honor it after it has been signed, precisely because Ukraine will become empowered by doing so, and Russia does not want to have to restart the conflict or renegotiate terms under circumstances where Ukraine is more powerful. It is the same sort of mechanism as Ukrainian entry into NATO, where Russia calculates that fighting a war today, before a shift in the balance of power, will result in an outcome, even net its costs, that is better than whatever the best it can hope for in a negotiated settlement later, once Ukraine is in better bargaining position. As you may have gathered, I think that this explanation for why the war continues is plausible. And if we go to what is often described as a historical analog, the Korean War, you get a further understanding about why that one was able to be settled when it was, and why it's more difficult to settle things now between Russia and Ukraine. North and South Korea settled after a long period of relative stalemate on the ground, where both sides were barely making any real moves, and entrenchments were naturally forming as a consequence of the static line of control. As a result, The construction of the demilitarized zone did not result in a shift in the balance of power that was unfavorable to one party or the other. It was just reinforcing the status quo. One more note about this mechanism. There's an alternative narrative that if Russia is given the chance to rebuild via a ceasefire, then Russia will come back later and stronger. In other words, today's war outcome on the right is what happens if Russia and Ukraine continue to fight. But if Ukraine pauses for any moment, then Russia will rebuild and the expected outcome thereafter will be significantly further to the west once a war restarts. Although I do not want to fully adjudicate that argument right now, there are a couple of reasons to be skeptical. First, Russia is the one with the initiative in this moment, and as long as Russia has the initiative, it is unclear why Russia would be the one who benefits from a timeout. Second, Ukraine is fully capable of rearming in the interim as well, and importantly, they can build those fortifications that we just talked about. It is also true that Europe needs time to rebuild its military-industrial base, and Ukraine would benefit from that in the long run. Nevertheless, it is curious that we're hearing these competing arguments being made at the same time, even though it is literally impossible for both of them to be true. Military power is zero-sum, so either Ukraine is going to benefit from the pause, or Russia is going to benefit from the pause. They both can't benefit from the pause. They may save on the cost of war for a short period of time, but in terms of the long-run trajectory of the balance of power, only one of them is capable ultimately of benefiting from the pause. Okay, getting to the last reason why the Russia-Ukraine war may still be continuing, we're at Putin's personal benefits. Fair warning, I am skeptical. The basic argument is that Putin cannot politically survive in the Kremlin without greater returns from Russia's investment in the war. In other words, Russia has experienced so much loss of life in Ukraine that if all the Kremlin can show for it are perhaps 2 full oblasts and portions of 2 other oblasts, there will be so much ammunition for resistance groups and opposition groups that Putin will ultimately fall. Now, you do not need that extreme of an interpretation for this to cause a problem. There just has to be a significant difference in Putin's political survival chances, given a ceasefire at the relative balance of power today, versus what he might be able to randomly get if he continues to fight, knowing that there is a downside risk that things might turn bad for Russia and Putin will be in an even worse position. Line-wise, this argument cheats on the idea that war is costly. That is definitely true at the country level. People aren't magically coming back to life as a consequence of a war being fought, nor is money magically being created. Well, technically you can print more money, and Russia is certainly doing that, but the value that underlies those dollars or rubles is not going to magically appear out of thin air. Such is life when bombs are being produced and then bombs are subsequently being detonated. But what if war is not costly at the level of the person making the decision to actually fight or not? It turns out that such a situation, perhaps surprisingly, still leaves open room for negotiation. Remember, Russia's costs for war are represented by the space between the white and the red lines. Thus, if war is free from the perspective of Vladimir Putin, then there is no space between those lines, and they need to overlap. But Russia's red line remains, well, its red line, and you'll notice that there are compatible agreements here. Remember, Ukraine needs something east of the yellow line, and Russia needs something west of the red line, and those demands are currently compatible. Perhaps even more surprisingly, if war not only is free for a leader, but provides personal benefits like what we were suggesting a moment ago, it is still possible that a deal can be done. It just can't be the case that that red line is drifting further and further away from the white line. Here, the direct benefit for Putin is the space between the red and the white lines, but this time because the red line has crossed the white line, it's no longer a cost, but a benefit. All we are seeing, though, is a collapsing of the bargaining range, but not a complete collapse of the bargaining range. There's still space there. It is less favorable to Ukraine, and ironically, even though this is Putin's personal benefits that are driving it, if you think about this from the perspective of an average Russian, this bargaining range looks better to them than maybe this one over here or this one even further back. However, the personal benefits cannot be too extreme. Again, small benefits are okay, but if you keep giving Putin more and more personal benefits for fighting, Eventually, they're going to exceed Ukraine's cost for war. At that point, we no longer have a mutually compatible bargaining range, and thus we have a theoretically plausible explanation for war. But theory and practice are different beasts. To be blunt, I think that this is a misreading of the situation. The political risks to the Kremlin in 2025 look very different as compared to, say, September of 2022, when you'll recall that Russia engaged in a mobilization effort. At the time, things were looking very bad for Russia. Ukraine was on the offensive, and it wasn't clear whether Russia was going to be able to stop it. As a result, settling under the military situation of September 2022 may have been politically risky indeed for the Kremlin. And, ironically enough, the way that the Kremlin fought back against that was to take a politically risky step. As the saying goes, though, desperate times call for desperate measures, and here it appears to have paid off for the Kremlin. The mobilization efforts were pivotal to stopping the Ukrainian offensive, eventually. Now, had the Kremlin continued to use that mobilization procedure to fuel the Russian army for the next 2 years, then yes, Putin would be in a political corner, and having the amount of territory that Russia currently does in Ukraine may not be sufficient to guarantee Putin's political survival. But precisely because the mobilization procedures were so unpopular, the Kremlin quickly switched to voluntary contracts. In other words, those that are joining the Russian forces now are being offered competitive wages, even holding fixed the risk premium associated with joining an army, being sent to Ukraine, and likely being either dismembered or killed. To fall back to that same cliché, desperate times call for desperate measures, and poor people in Russia may be willing to sign up for incredibly large sums of money from their perspective, even if they know that they might not return, because at least they'll be able to provide for their family even in their death. In any case, because this has become essentially a business operation, we don't really see a public outcry for compensation due to some sort of deficit of national pride. In fact, because of competitive wage pressures coming from the Ministry of Defense, a lot of average Russians are benefiting from the war being fought. And I'm not just talking about those that are going to Ukraine. Russians who are staying behind and working in factories are also making a killing. Rather, the more serious threat to the regime right now is coming from the oligarch class, who are the ones that are paying for the war one way or another, either via higher taxes or implicitly because they are unable to trade with the West. They just want the war to be over, and as long as the war continues, then they are the ones that could cause political problems for the Kremlin. But if the war ends tomorrow, that is no longer a concern. And as a result, I am skeptical that Putin's personal benefits are what's driving the war to continue. Now we can move on to the third major topic of conversation for today, which is how wars end. And you may remember that I previewed at least part of this when we first looked at the recipe for war. That had 2 steps. 1, a substantive disagreement between the 2 parties, and 2, a bargaining friction that prevents the parties from reaching an agreement that would save them the costs of war. Well, thinking about war termination, there's an easy way and a hard way to do that, especially if you're thinking about this from the perspective of a third party who may be interested in manipulating the conflict incentives. The easy way recognizes that both of these conditions are necessary for a war to occur. As a result, if you attack the bargaining friction and eliminate it, then there's no need for the parties to continue fighting. They won't necessarily agree on what the world should look like, but the costs of war will remain paramount, and they can negotiate a resolution based off of trying to avoid those costs. Now, I call this the easy way, because if you resolve the bargaining friction, the parties will naturally want to terminate the conflict on their own. Sometimes, the course of the war itself will naturally resolve the bargaining friction, which means third parties, in theory, can just step back and wait for that to happen. On the other hand, third parties might be impatient, and at that point, if they want to help try to resolve the conflict, they need to figure out what the underlying bargaining friction is that's preventing the parties from resolving the conflict on their own, and then do something to try to manipulate that bargaining friction. Sometimes this is feasible, other times it is more difficult. Either way, you still have to identify the bargaining friction, and that's why we spent the last section trying to go through the possibilities as it relates to the current war between Russia and Ukraine. And you'll remember that we left with two plausible possibilities. So let's go through both of those and try to understand how you might resolve a bargaining friction in the middle of a war that meets those sorts of conditions. Well, possibility number one was differing expectations about what the outcome of the war would be, and the private information that might come along when there is uncertainty over the expected outcome. For this type of bargaining friction, the way that the war ends is if the parties converge on their expectations. At that point, once they are in agreement, the costs of the war again take over. If you think back to the brief narrative I gave you about the Korean War, that got settled when there was a converged expectation that the front lines were not going to be moving much anymore, and if they kept on fighting, they would basically be achieving the same sort of thing. Well, there's no uncertainty about what the outcome of the war is going to produce, so you might as well settle and stop the killing. However, getting to that point can take a long time, in part because communicating your private information is not so simple. Yes, I am still describing this as the easy way to end a conflict, but no conflict ultimately is easy in an objective sense to end. Actually, you probably already have a good sense about why it's so difficult to communicate private information under these circumstances. Think about everything that has gone on in this war as it relates to the red lines that Russia has. And I'm not referring to the literal red lines on maps. I'm talking about the figurative things that the Kremlin claims. That if the West or Ukraine does such and such, that will be a red line for the Kremlin, and Moscow will respond with harsh countermeasures. It turns out that trying to communicate such things comes with a credibility problem, which again is something that the Kremlin is intimately familiar with. In short, talk is cheap. If you make a threat and the opponent believes it, they will buckle to your demands, and you will get something very good for yourself at no direct cost. But precisely because you get a good outcome for free, alternative versions of you, who are less resolved, who perceive the costs of war to be higher, and have less military capacity to follow through on the threats, still want to issue the same type of threat. Why? Well, if the other side buckles to your demands, you don't actually pay those costs or incur the risks that come along with following through on the threat. Consequently, the incentive is to make those types of cheap talk declarations, regardless of whether you are strong or weak, resolved or unresolved, or have high costs or low costs. As a consequence of that, under most circumstances, opponents should not infer anything from those types of messages being sent. Hence the cliche from this channel, don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do. Actual actions incur costs and entail some risks. As a result, it is harder, though still not impossible, for those less resolved and less powerful types to bluff in the same way. And this is not just an issue for Russia, it's also a problem for Europe. When you hear Western leaders say, "We are in this until the end," it is not inherently believable from the Kremlin's perspective either. As a result, if this is the underlying bargaining problem that's prolonging the war, it is not the type of thing that can be resolved in the short run. Rather, Europe's credibility is something that needs to be demonstrated in the long run. That Europe does follow through on commitments to increase aid funding to Ukraine, and to make the underlying investments that are necessary for Europe to boost materiel production. At that point, the Kremlin will see the demonstrated commitment, perhaps update its information that Europe is there for the long haul, and then reduce its own demands. Taking a trip across the Atlantic, it seems like we might actually be making negative progress here. At the risk of repeating myself to no end, I have a hard time articulating what the Trump administration's strategy is here, and it may very well have changed 3 times between when I started recording this video and, well, right now in the middle of this video. That is not a good recipe for trying to resolve the Kremlin's underlying beliefs about the relative distribution of power in the long run between the two sides. Undoubtedly, the Kremlin is becoming more optimistic as of late, and perhaps that is the right inference to make. On the other hand, maybe he's still leaving open the possibility of flip-flopping here, at which point the optimism from the Kremlin is unwarranted, and we're further away from being able to reach a settlement. And all of that does not even take into account the inferences that Ukraine might be making here. Now, the funny thing is that there are means within the United States legal system to establish credibility here. an act of Congress that funds Ukraine for a long-term period would actually do something like that. The reason being, to overturn an act of Congress, you need another act of Congress. This creates a status quo bias in the system of the United States. If you have something that is already law, to change it, you would need to have a majority from the House of Representatives, a supermajority from the Senate because of the filibuster rule, and the approval of the President of the United States to overturn that law. This is a mechanism that allows the United States to credibly commit to long-run policies if they so choose. And I suppose, in some ways, the fact that the United States has not done this before, either during the Biden administration or now during the early parts of the Trump administration, speaks volumes about the credibility of the United States, or at least the willingness of the United States to put forth long-run commitments. Transitioning to the other plausible source of a bargaining friction right now, the lack of fortifications that Ukraine has, well, there's some good news here. This one is a lot easier to resolve. You just build the entrenchments. That way, when there is a ceasefire and settlement put into place, the shift in the balance of power that will occur as a consequence of that will be relatively minimal. That is because, once you have established the entrenchments, Russia is no longer making progress on the ground, and thus the shift in the balance of power that would result from a ceasefire and a deal being made would be relatively small. That is basically the same argument about the Korean Peninsula and why the Korean War ended. As such, if Europe is going to be to some degree involved in the fortification lines and the entrenchments after a ceasefire is established, there's little reason why Europe should not be involved to some degree right now. Clearly, the thinking in European capitals right now is that if you go into an active war zone in Ukraine, your soldiers might get shot at which point there are going to be deeper questions about what you will do in response and how willing you are to be involved in this war. The thing is, though, that doesn't really change after the settlement is made. If Russia does not believe that you are credible and that you are willing to fight back in the event that you are fired upon, then placing your soldiers in those trenches after a ceasefire has been established doesn't really do much. And actually, you may never even get to that step, because Russia will just keep on marching. Ukraine will not be able to establish a defensive perimeter without Europe's help, perhaps. And as a result, we just keep going further and further west over time without a ceasefire ever actually getting established. Well, that takes care of the easy way, and if that is supposed to be easy, God help us with the hard way. But here goes. The hard way ignores the bargaining frictions of the bilateral relationship between the two main combatants, and instead goes deep on manipulating the war payoffs. The upshot with this strategy is that it is mostly agnostic about what the underlying bargaining friction is. So if not only we as analysts, but also the practitioners, are unsure about what's driving the war, whether it is the expected outcome of the war being in disagreement, or the lack of entrenchments on the Ukrainian side, or maybe a third thing, they don't actually have to figure that out to get the war to be resolved. The negative is that it can be more expensive to resolve the conflict because you haven't solved the underlying bargaining friction. That's why this is the hard way. It's essentially a brute force solution to the problem. Also, because you are not resolving the bilateral bargaining problem, the moment that you stop being a part of the peace process, the war is liable to restart. Brief aside, it is possible that these brute force tactics can have unanticipated side effects and exacerbate the underlying bargaining frictions. Those types of mechanisms are in fact the types of things that I am most interested in studying as an academic. Good news here is that I don't think that they're really applying to the situation at hand, so I'm not going to talk about it further. How exactly do you go brute forcing a solution to the problem? Well, usually there are two strategies here. One is known as peace subsidies, and it was a major driver of what went on with the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. The standard narrative of the Camp David summit is that Jimmy Carter was a master diplomat going back and forth between the two delegations and figuring out something that would ultimately work. Well, he did do a lot of running around, but where the real heavy lifting came in was what Jimmy Carter was offering both sides as long as they agreed to some sort of peace deal. And that is exactly what a peace subsidy is. It is an amount of money or other sort of concession that is given to one or both parties if and only if there is not a war? Well, from an opportunity cost perspective, if the benefits of peace are larger as a consequence of the third party's proposal, then, effectively speaking, the costs of war have become larger, which means the bargaining range has increased. Fortunately, for most bargaining frictions, the end result of this is that the circumstances where peace transpires is larger than in the absence of that third-party peace subsidy. In that light, what has kept the peace between Egypt and Israel is a long-run flow of aid from the United States to both of those parties as a way of saying thank you for having just a little bit more peace in the Middle East. Interesting note there. Remember 3 months ago when the Trump administration was trying to shut down USAID? Oh wait, that was 3 weeks ago. Everything happens really quickly nowadays. Well, it seems like one of the only things that survived those cuts was the assistance provided to Israel and Egypt. Again, because it's a peace subsidy, and if that were to disappear, well, you might see conflict resume between those two parties. Or maybe somehow Doge overlooked that. I have now just pointed it out to him, and we'll suddenly see that aid be cut in short order. If so, my bad. To visualize what's going on here, let's go back to the situation between Russia and Ukraine. Remember, a peace subsidy effectively acts as an additional cost of war. So instead of having costs like this as a baseline, when you have the third party offering the peace subsidy, those costs might get larger like this. Both sides' reservation values have become a little bit more relaxed, and so now it might be possible to get a deal done here that was not possible previously. The other main brute force way to try to build a peace is through conditional armament, which was a big part of the Dayton Agreement. The United States was already intervening in the Bosnian War, but at the same time, wanted to see it come to an end. Basically, the United States told Yugoslavia that Yugoslavia had to sign the agreement, otherwise the United States would increase its support to the opposition. Meanwhile, if the opposition refused to play ball, then the United States would withdraw some of its military support. This remains the most likely means that the United States will use between Russia and Ukraine. That is Keith Kellogg that you see on your screen, the United States' special envoy to Ukraine. He is a Trump appointee, and last year he co-authored a peace plan that essentially tries to leverage those conditional armaments to convince Ukraine and Russia to reach a deal. Now, there has been a whole lot of intrigue over the last couple of weeks about Keith Kellogg perhaps being squeezed out of the peace process. But for now, this is the only thing that we have to go on. The Trump administration hasn't really detailed any other alternative mechanism to enforce the peace. Thus, until we hear differently, the plan is, if Russia does not sign on, the United States will massively ramp up aid to Ukraine, and meanwhile, if Ukraine does not sign on, then the United States will abandon Ukraine. To visualize what's going on here, let's use uncertainty over the outcome of the war as the bargaining friction. The logic works relatively similarly if the bargaining friction were about Ukrainian entrenchments, but let's just do only one of these. So in this visualization, Russia thinks that it is likely to win a whole lot of Ukrainian territory, whereas Ukraine thinks that the more likely outcome is something moderate. And right now, there is a small level of support to Ukraine. Okay, let's isolate Russia's expectation for a moment and think about the red line that's associated with it. If the United States ramps up aid, what happens? Well, remember, the white line is the expected outcome, and the red line is tied to that white line going east of it. So if you increase aid massively, you shift Russia's expectations over, and with it, you shift its red line. As a result, if Russia thinks it is on relatively firm ground given the status quo, it doesn't matter if the United States is increasing aid massively like this. Russia feels obligated to settle under relatively favorable terms to Ukraine. Resetting things, let's look at Ukraine's perspective now. This yellow line represents its bottom line, and think about how it is going to move in the absence of US military aid. It is tied to that white line going west, and thus if you withdraw aid, the white line goes back, the yellow line with it, and now Ukraine becomes malleable as well. Thus, you have two sides that are very much open to having a negotiated settlement, out of fear that something much worse will happen if they refuse. And that takes us to the final topic for today, which is the set of problems that come along with trying to implement such a peace plan. Actually, I have a list of 5 of them. U.S. production limitations, U.S. political credibility of increasing aid, Russia's belief about U.S. credibility, how Europe will respond to all of this, and what's going to happen with the long-run enforcement of any peace plan. You may recall that we had a video on this topic not too long ago. Well, we'll get into greater depth today. But besides that, a whole bunch has changed in the bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia, the United States and Ukraine, and the United States and Europe. So we need to discuss how that's going to fit in with all of this. Back to the list of the 5. Production limitations are a prerequisite for the other problems that follow, so let's focus on that to begin with. The basic idea is that if you want to coerce Russia into an agreement that it might not otherwise be willing to, if it wasn't worried about US intervention, you actually have to be able to shift the line on your screen. Well, how much in terms of arms assistance do you have to give to meaningfully shift that line? If it is going to be, say, a whole bunch of stuff, you actually have to be able to produce all of that stuff to have the effect that you want. If you can't actually shift the line, then Russia is not going to be worried about what the effect of increased aid to Ukraine is. Well, the problem there is arms donations are limited to what you can produce. And after the Cold War ended, the United States actively engaged in a round of contraction of arms suppliers and manufacturing facilities. Indeed, at one point, the Department of Defense basically got all of the main military contractors that the United States had into a room and told them, look, there's not going to be as much funding in the future. You guys need to start merging together, otherwise some of you are going to go bankrupt. Now, to be clear, this was a sensible choice at the time. US military spending during the Cold War was elevated because there was a great threat from the Soviet Union. Without the Soviet Union in the picture anymore, there was not as much need to spend on military capacity. Of course, in some sense, it might be nice to have excess military capacity, but if you think about long-run coercive capability, the more that you are spending on your military, the more that you're diverting economic incentives to a productive economy, which means your economy is not going to grow as much. In turn, much later down the line, if you really want to ramp up your military spending, you don't have as large of an economy, so you can't spend as much on your military. Consequently, as bizarre as it may seem, reducing production capacity in the early 1990s actually boosted US potential military production into the future. The key word there, though, is potential. In the meantime, the United States adopted what is known as just-in-time manufacturing, where the United States intentionally was not trying to stock up its warehouses, and rather produce according to demand. If someone needs something this month, then it will be produced this month. They won't be pulling from the shelves and then trying to restock the shelves later. Again, in terms of the pure economics of the situation, just-in-time manufacturing is great. It is cheaper, it is more profitable. But in terms of having an insurance policy about what could happen in the future, it has some risks. Now that the United States is in a situation where it would be nice to have large stockpiles, well, the United States is out of luck with that one. Although it is not the end of the world from the American perspective, the United States needs to take active steps to return to a position similar to the 1980s. It cannot just take existing factories and run them for longer hours. No, there has to be deeper investment to produce more factories that can produce more supplies. What's interesting about the most recent developments between the United States and Russia is that the Trump administration seems to be saying that it wants to figure out ways to cut back on military spending, which is the opposite from a lot of the conversation that had taken place in the months before Trump came into office, both from Trump and previously the Biden administration. Now, there are some deeper problems with that philosophy and trying to implement this peace plan, and we'll get to those in a minute. But at least from a basic perspective of trying to shift Russia's expectation from here to all the way over here, the philosophy isn't necessarily running against that. The reason being is that much of the discussion has been couched in terms of conditional disarmament, that the United States is only willing to cut back on its production if China and Russia agree to do the same. Well, that would have to presuppose that the war in Ukraine comes to some sort of end, which means that the United States has Russia agreeing to something, which means that the United States does not actually have to produce all of these extra armaments precisely because Russia is agreeing to the deal. So that part is okay, but it does raise questions about the second part, which is the political credibility of increasing aid. Trump spent most of 2024 on the campaign trail, arguing that investment in Ukraine was a waste of US taxpayer dollars. Important to note here, I'm not talking about military production in general, but specifically aid to Ukraine was a waste. That being the case, it raises questions whether Trump would actually arm Ukraine when push comes to shove if Russia withdraws from the sort of peace plan that Trump has in mind. And that is before we even start thinking about the broader DOGE agenda to reduce government spending. Actually, at the time of the recording, it seems where DOGE is next planning to go is the Department of Defense. Why does that matter? Well, think back to my earlier warning. Do not listen to what leaders say, watch what they do. And as a corollary to that, do not listen to what leaders threaten to do. Pay attention to what they are capable and willing to do when push comes to shove. It is not good enough to simply say that Russia's expectation looks like this absent increased US aid, and that, conditional on the US providing aid, Russia's expectation shifts to over here. If you actually want Russia's red line to be that far east, and thus Russia be malleable in peace negotiations, it needs to be true, again, when push comes to shove, that the United States would follow through on the threat and increase military aid if Russia refuses to play ball in negotiations. Absent that, it does not matter what Trump says that he is going to do, or the other sorts of threats that he levies at Russia. If Trump is not going to follow through, then Russia's expectation actually just stays over here, and in turn, Russia will be much more belligerent in negotiations. If you think that was problematic, don't you worry. It gets worse. Issue number 3 is Russia's belief about US credibility. So we're moving away from what the United States would do and getting to a meta-belief about what Russia thinks the United States would do, which is equally important to getting all of this to work. Once more, this line represents Russia's expected outcome of the war, conditional on the United States increasing its aid. Or, more precisely, conditional on the amount of aid that Russia perceives that the United States will provide. In turn, if Russia's expectation is that the United States will not provide 9 of these shiny HIMARS vehicles, but rather stick to the one that was representing the status quo quantity that the United States was providing Ukraine, then the line isn't all the way over here. It's back to where we were before. This then creates the problem where Russia refuses to negotiate, believing that the United States does not actually have any leverage, but the United States does have leverage. And so when Russia starts standing firm, the United States actually has to respond by providing all of the materiel to Ukraine. This outcome is much worse for the United States than the situation where Russia actually believes the threat, because when Russia believes the threat, the United States doesn't even need to follow through to get Russia to comply. Here, the United States does have to follow through, which means the United States has to spend all of the money sending the armaments to Ukraine. Now, the partial solution to this problem is to just start arming Ukraine now. Unlike verbal threats, where you shouldn't listen to what leaders say, if you watch what they do, and they spend money on arming Ukraine, that conveys credibility that words cannot. Because if Trump really did not care at all about the situation, he might not even begin the process of increasing some amount of aid. Instead, we seem to be moving in almost the exact opposite direction, where the United States is either withdrawing or withholding aid to Ukraine, even before there is a real peace offer on the table. Consequently, the United States is losing leverage there. Now, this may ultimately amount to nothing. After all, if Ukraine is losing military aid, then now Ukraine is going to be more likely to buckle in any sort of peace negotiation. In turn, we may not ever see the situation where Russia is refusing a negotiated settlement, and so the United States has to ramp up military aid back to Ukraine. Nevertheless, there remains the background problem, where if the Trump administration 2 weeks from now decides to switch its stance and go a little bit harder on Russia and provide more assistance to Ukraine, It may not strike the Kremlin as being particularly credible if you're going back and forth like that. But let's continue with the thought process about what happens if the United States abandons Ukraine. Well, there's another important actor here: Europe. What would Europe do next after that? Again, there have been recent developments on that front, which seem to make this question all the more pertinent. Europe is very unhappy right now. They've been shut out of bilateral talks between the United States and Russia. They've also been frustrated with Ukraine not being invited to those talks as well, even if Europe was not there. They have been convening political summits to try to figure out what Europe needs to do by itself if Europe is not going to have a literal or figurative seat at the table. And perhaps the most important part here, and something that we have not yet discussed, is the concerns that Europe has about where the line is going to be drawn. Let's go back to that situation where there is conditional military armament. When those threats are believed, you can get quite a large bargaining range. Here, because Ukraine is so scared about being cut from military aid, its yellow line is pretty far to the west, meaning that is the bottom line for Ukraine in a negotiated settlement. Meanwhile, because Russia is equally concerned about Ukraine receiving ample military aid if it does not come to the table, Russia's red line has shifted very far to the east, and thus now Moscow is also very malleable in the negotiations. As a result, the bargaining range is huge, but there are critical distributional consequences of that. Ukraine would like a finalized line of control to be as far to the east as possible, and for its part, Russia has the opposite preference. It wants the line of control as far west as possible. As of late, it seems that the Trump administration is willing to have the line of control be relatively far to the west, and perhaps not as dramatic as what I've drawn on the screen, but still very concerning to both Ukraine, and more important for the conversation right now, Europe. That is because Europe has agency here as well, and if the United States chooses to cut aid to Ukraine, there's no reason that Europe cannot step up to replace at least some of it, if not the majority of it. To visualize what I mean, let's start with the status quo, and Russia's expectation conditional on how much military aid is currently flowing to the country. If Ukraine refuses to negotiate, then the United States pulls the aid, and Ukraine's expectation was supposed to move back to here. But the without support label is misleading. Europe, of course, is already providing support, and if Europe ramps up that support in the absence of the United States, perhaps Ukraine's expectation is actually over here. If so, then Ukraine's position is malleable, but the Trump administration might not have as much leverage as it would hope for. There is an important caveat here, though, that Europe has the same production capacity that the United States has, but worse. Europe also took advantage of the end of the Cold War to contract its military industry, but unlike the United States, Europe has not been as actively involved in international military affairs in the interim. As a result, the United States still has more capacity than Europe does. Therefore, in a video full of irony, we get to another ironic point, which is that Europe will likely have to buy from the United States if Europe wants to supply Ukraine to the level as perhaps Ukraine needs to be supplied. There are also questions about where Europe will get the money to do all of this, and you may have noticed within the last week and a half or 2 weeks that there's been increased discussion about using the frozen Russian assets, the most of which Europe is in control of, to spend that money to buy US military goods to then send over to Ukraine for Ukraine to fight Russia. On one hand, this is going to make Trump very happy, at least in the short run, because it means Europe is spending money in the United States. That means that US businesses are doing well, and that is certainly something that Trump likes. Never mind that Trump really wants Europe to contribute more to defense. Remember that whole 2% of GDP thing. So it is possible that Trump has goaded Europe into doing exactly what Trump wants Europe to do. But on the other hand, there is a long-run problem here. You get a palpable feeling that Europe has grown extremely frustrated with the United States, and the Trump administration specifically, and now no longer views the United States as a 100% reliable partner. As a result, Europe's interest in investing in its own domestic production has massively increased even in the last few weeks. In turn, Europe may only be interested in using the US military industry as a bridge until Europe can get its own factories running and achieve self-sufficiency. And yeah, Trump wants Europe to do more, but the best case scenario for the United States is that Europe is investing European money into the United States to help out with that. Instead, the Trump administration is driving Europe away from the United States, which may ultimately leave the United States in a weaker position on its own military footing. Last up are problems with long-run enforcement. As we have discussed earlier, wars basically never end in ideological agreement. They end when someone has been militarily defeated, or in the event of some sort of peace deal, war has done something, or third parties have done something, to resolve the bargaining friction between the two, or at least make the bargaining friction irrelevant. Regardless of whether the bargaining friction has been resolved, any sort of peace agreement between two actors has to, at some level, reflect the balance of power between the coalitions that are at war. Consequently, this raises the question of what happens if we are in a situation where the ceasefire is implemented, but Russia keeps building weapons, and Europe's shipments dry up. Well, visualizing the problem. Again, deals are a function of where the balance of power falls between the two. If, following a ceasefire, Russia keeps arming without a counterbalance from Ukraine or the West, what war would produce if war restarts slowly begins to creep westward. At that point, either the deal needs to be renegotiated, which means further concessions from Ukraine, or Russia is going to restart the war. Neither of those outcomes are good for the West. The upshot here is that Kellogg is cognizant of this problem and includes recommendations in the plan for long-run armament to Ukraine to enforce the peace wherever the peace is set up at. The flip side is that the political situation as it relates to the Trump administration seems to be going in the opposite direction. If the Trump administration views the end of the war as the end of the need to actually provide assistance, regardless of whatever Kellogg was saying in his peace plan, then we're going to run into trouble here. Then again, we ought to go back to that discussion regarding entrenchments, and how the post-war fortifications are supposed to seal up whatever the line of control is when the ceasefire is declared. That, for the last time this video, may be putting more pressure on Europe to figure out the solution to this problem if the United States is trying to withdraw itself from the situation. Whew, we really have covered quite a bit of ground today, haven't we? I hope that you've enjoyed being in the trenches with me for it. War is a puzzle, and trying to understand everything that goes along with it, especially this particular war between Russia and Ukraine, well, that feels like it's a project for a dissertation. But more than 75 minutes later, there still is a simple step that can help keep you informed. All you have to do is go to ground.news/linesonmaps and sign up for Ground News' Vantage plan. You'll even get 40% off by doing so. It will not only keep you informed, but it sure does help this channel. And if you're looking for something after that, well, then I have good news on that front because I have 2 fantastic books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this marathon of a video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.